Thank you, Mariana. And hello, everyone. As you heard earlier today, Brad mentioned that diversity is all about inclusive growth. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. I am super excited to be here with Kenji. Kenji, I want to say a quick hello and thank you for your time today.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you so much, Nelly, for having me.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to this conversation because we're both very passionate around the topic of inclusive growth. And as we think about this, we know there are two ways of looking at this. We have to look at it from the business perspective and from the people perspective. And as I think about the journey of inclusion and diversity, I know that there are typically four different phases. We have the phase of is the right thing to do, or we have the phase of what is the business case around it. Then we get into, well, we got those two already. Now, who's accountable for all of this? And as we think about the accountability, then it really evolves to it's really everybody's responsibility at any level throughout the organization. So as I think about inclusion, diversity, equality, equity, I think about the business responsibility and having leaders look at it from the perspective of that it's a business advantage and a business edge to be able to evolve around diversity. So as I think about this, Kenji, I want to get your perspective and your insights. So how did you get involved in this space? I think for us that are really deep in it, like we are, we always have a story around it, but how did you get involved? What inspired you to really step into the space the way you have?
Yeah, I mean, there's both a personal and a professional answer to that. So the personal answer is that, as an Asian American, as a gay man, I struggled for a long time to belong and really believe that this is one of the core things that not just organizations need to do, but American society needs to get right. From a professional perspective, I thought that I was going to vindicate those ambitions through the law. So I am to this day a constitutional law professor and I teach civil rights law. But over time, I realized that the law was very limited in what it could do to address certain issues relating to diversity and inclusion. And I started to move into the field, as distinct from simply looking at it through a legal lens. So specifically, I think my biggest contribution, at least to date, I hope I'll make others to the diversity and inclusion field, is this concept of covering. This is the subject of my first book. And there I say, I'm very puzzled by the fact that the law protects me, from discrimination against my status as an Asian American, or today my status as a gay man. But it actually doesn't cover the behavioral aspects of my identity, that someone can say to me, Kenji, don't act so fresh off the boat, or downplay the aspects of you that make you stick out as an Asian American. Or alternatively, it's fine for you to be gay, but you might want to think twice about bringing your husband to this big client dinner, right? Those kinds of sort of second generation forms of bias are things that the law has a much harder time redressing. I'm not saying that it's impossible to get redress for them, but it's going to be very, very risky for a plaintiff to say, I'm going to bring a lawsuit against that. So at the end of this book, I say this actually isn't a legal problem. This is a problem that organizations have to deal with as a matter of culture. So that's my story. I'd love to actually flip it back to you. You're a redoubtable figure in the D&I world. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your story, how you got into D&I at Accenture.
Thank you, Kenji, and thank you for all that you've done in this space and for also sharing your story. I think when we're out there and we are advocating for diversity, I tell people we have to carry this brand of courage as we tell our own stories. So as I think about my story, it starts from the perspective that when I started at Accenture over 35 years ago, there were not so many people like me. So I knew that I wanted to change the culture, evolve the culture. And I always tell the story that I came into a very conservative environment and I showed up in a satin tangerine suit with 6 huge gold buttons, and my shoes were yellow, orange, and black with gold hoop earrings. And if you think about back then, a conservative place, and I'm showing up with a very Latina-ness, sort of culture, it was a very challenging time. But what I understood was that I had the responsibility to share my story, share my culture so that I can help evolve the current corporate culture. And I think everybody needs to take on some of that. So as I think about what you said, a couple of things jump out at me, right? If you want to leverage a diverse talent, you have to be able to create that psychological safety. And I think about, we want people to take risks. We want them to innovate. We want them to ideate. We can't have people do that if they don't feel that they're being advocated for, if they're being sponsored or mentored. So it's important that we do that. So as we attract, retain, develop, and advance talent, there are three things organizations must do. And we did this in one of our research here at Accenture for one of our International Women's Day celebration. We talk about how important it is to have bold leadership. We talk about how important it is to have comprehensive actions that are going to help change some of the policies and the benefits and how we really solve for our people. And we have to have an empowering environment so people feel empowered to be their authentic self and be able to take those risks to innovate and to ideate, to really evolve an organization. So as I think about that, I know you worked with many organizations, Kenji, and what has been your experience in doing so?
Yeah, those are wonderful insights. And there's a lot of overlap with what I'm about to say in a positive way. So I've had the pleasure of working with lots and lots of organizations and the Fortune 500 and the MLA 100, universities and other educational environments. And I think regardless of the institution, there are really three things that I would say are really critical with regard to creating an environment. And I use the term psychological safety in my work as well, where you have the capacity to uncover your own talent. So the first one of those is to diagnose, right? So this is actually self-reflection and just understanding what you are doing with regard to covering. And my work, I disaggregate among 4 different axes of covering: appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association. Do you cover along one of those axes? Does it hurt you, right? If it does hurt you, is there some organizational value, right, that is being sort of implemented that could justify that form of covering? If the answer is yes, I'm doing it, yes, it hurts me, and no, the organization doesn't have an overriding organizational value, then you've completed your diagnosis and you need to challenge the organization to live up to its own values of inclusion rather than simply living under them. The second point is very similar to your point about leadership, which is that in our survey, we crowdsourced what people would want to see differently in various organizations, the survey of the entire Fortune 500. And what people said over and over again is that we want leaders to go first, because if leaders don't go first, we won't go at all. So the reason it's important for me to share my story, the reason it's important for you to share your story, and I love the story about the tangerine suit, is because if we don't go first and other people don't have the kind of space to go at all, because we're the senior leaders in our respective spaces, and so we have to actually make the road, right? Sharing your story, stories of us, both of these are incredibly powerful initiatives and among the kind of best initiatives I've seen in organizations. And then finally, with your point about creating environments where people can succeed, if somebody says to me, it's fine for you to be gay, but don't bring your husband to a client dinner, it actually can't be on me and shouldn't be on me to respond to that every single time. Like, I'm going to get that day after day after day, depending on what organization I belong to. So I actually need allies. So building a culture that is rich in allies is a critical imperative with regard to this. And, whether that's working with, again, Microsoft, or whether that's working with Disney on allyship initiatives, these organizations have really stepped up to the plate and said, like leaders, as you said yourself, Nellie, and we didn't plan this beforehand, audience, but as you said earlier, leaders are really critical, but then the step beyond the leaders is to sort of bake it into your culture and to make it everybody's responsibility. Because so many covering demands, like so many diversity and inclusion issues, are so infinite and infinitesimal in their nature that it can't be up to a few leaders to put on their superhero capes and fly around and solve the problems. We're just not going to be able to do that. So it has to be distributed across the entire organization. This is not to let ourselves off the hook as leaders, but to say that there's certain things that only a really broad-based initiative, like an allyship initiative, is going to be able to solve.
Absolutely. So as we close this, Kenji, thank you for sharing all that. And if I sum all of this up and I think about how I started is, thank goodness we work in an environment today that I could have shown up today with that tangerine suit and no one would ask any questions. So we have evolved. And what I would say is that real progress requires real work with real satisfaction, because if we get this right, we solve for everybody. So thank you so much for what you do again and for your time today. And thank you all. And back to you, Mariana.